The air inside Sector 4 of the Alloy 7 complex did not smell of medicine, though it was ostensibly a surgical ward. It smelled of ozone, burnt hair, and the sickly sweet copper tang of industrial lubricants mixed with arterial blood. Hans looked at his hands. They were encased in the manipulator, a hydraulic exoskeleton that amplified his movements but stripped him of any tactile sensation. He was a master watchmaker forced to work with a sledgehammer. Before him, clamped to a table made of reinforced Siberian oak, lay a man who had once been a person. Now, he was a geography of trauma. The patient's chest cavity was propped open by chrome-plated spreaders. Hans could see the lungs, grayish and soot-stained from years of Soviet cigarettes, struggling to expand against the intrusion of the iron ribs. These were not just supports, they were serrated steel bands designed to house micro-servos that would eventually power a heavy weapons harness. Colonel Borodin stood in the corner, the red star on his cap gleaming in the harsh, flickering light of the overhead lamps. He blew a thick cloud of Makorka smoke into the sterilized zone. In the USSR, the colonel liked to say, even the air belonged to the state, and the state was not interested in sterility, it was interested in results. Start the fusion, Hans, Borodin said, his voice a low growl. The motherland is tired of waiting for her new sons. Hans picked up the neuro-welder. The device hummed with a predatory energy. The patient, a former Red Army major named Sokolov who had been purged for ideological deviance, began to wake from his inadequate anesthesia. Because his vocal cords had already been replaced with experimental brass resonance membranes, he did not scream. Instead, a pure, terrifyingly beautiful $C\# note vibrated through the room. It was a sound of absolute, crystalline agony. Hans felt a bead of sweat sting his eye, but he could not wipe it. He pressed the welder to the major's spinal column. The goal was to fuse the nerves directly into the tungsten steel interface. As the arc struck, the smell of charred bone filled the room. Sokolov's body arched, his mechanical ribs clashing against each other with a sound like a freight train braking. Steady, Hans whispered to himself, or perhaps to the men he was unmaking. He was not just building a soldier. He was creating a stallion, a man of steel. In the propaganda posters, the Soviet worker was a titan of industry. Here, in the dark heart of the Urals, Hans was making that metaphor literal. He was bolting the Industrial Revolution directly into the human nervous system. When the session ended, Sokolov was still breathing, though the sound was now a rhythmic clicking of valves. The major's eyes, still human and wet with tears, tracked Hans with a gaze of such profound hatred that the engineer felt his soul wither. He lives, Borodin observed, tapping his holster. Clean him up. We have 49 more to go before the winter solstice. The great leader wants his iron guard. As the guards wheeled the clicking, whistling major away, Hans sank into a chair. His partner, Lev, a one-eyed physicist who had been a professor at Moscow State University before the gulags claimed him, approached silently. You did well today, Hans, Lev said, his voice devoid of emotion. You gave him another day of life. Whether that is a gift or a curse is a question for a philosopher, and philosophers are all dead in this country. Lev leaned in closer, the scent of lye and old paper clinging to his rags. The sensors in the ribs. IVE adjusted the calibration. They are not just for armor anymore. If you look at the frequency of the brass membranes, IVE added a subharmonic. Hans looked up, his brow furrowed. A subharmonic? For what? Lev's one eye glinted with a dangerous light. For communication, my friend. Metal conducts sound better than flesh. While they think we are building them a choir of monsters, we are actually building them a telephone line. The prisoners are starting to talk to each other through the pipes. They are calling themselves the Rusted. Hans looked at the heavy steel door where Sokolov had disappeared. He realized then that the Stalions were not just projects. They were a collective. A hive of steel and resentment, growing in the dark, waiting for a signal. And he, the man who held the welder, was the only one who could give it to them. The weeks that followed were a descent into a rhythmic, mechanical purgatory. The Sharashka operated on a 24-hour cycle, governed not by the sun, but by the relentless hum of the geothermal turbines buried even deeper in the rock. Hans became a ghost inhabiting a shell of fatigue. His world was reduced to the diameter of a surgical lens and the microscopic precision required to lace silver filaments through human muscle. Lev, the physicist, became his shadow. While Hans handled the wet work of integration, Lev managed the soul, the complex array of vacuum tubes and steel-cased processors that were mounted onto the prisoners' backs. These devices, housed in heavy rectangular canisters, were meant to be the brains of the Stalions, overriding human instinct with Pavlovian electronic pulses. "They think the brain is a radio," Lev whispered one evening as they worked on Subject 14, a former tank commander whose legs had been replaced by hydraulic struts. "They think if they broadcast a loud enough command, the men will vanish, and the machine will remain. But they forget about friction." Hans did not look up from his work. He was currently threading a cooling line into the commander's femoral artery to prevent the servos from cooking the surrounding flesh. "Friction kills the engine, Lev. Do not speak of it so loudly." "No, Hans. Friction is heat." "Heat is energy," Lev countered, his voice barely audible over the hiss of a nearby steam pipe. "I have modified the feedback loops in the canisters. Every time the guards use the agony pulse to discipline them, a small portion of that energy is diverted. It is stored in the brass membranes of their throats. We are not just giving them a voice, we are building a battery." Hans paused, the neuro-welder hovering millimeters from the commander's skin. He looked at the prisoner. The man was awake. The Stalions were rarely put under full anesthesia now, as the scientists needed to monitor nerve response in real time. The commander's eyes were fixed on the ceiling, but his fingers, now tipped with steel claws for trench digging, were twitching in a rhythmic pattern against the side of the table. Clack. Clack clack. Clack. He's listening, Hans realized. "They are all listening," Lev said. The vibration of the mountain, the hum of the turbines, the clinking of the spoons in the mess hall. They turned the entire camp into a resonator. Last night, Subject 22, the one with the steel jaw, managed to find the resonant frequency of his cell bars. He did not break them, he made them sing until the guard outside fainted from the ultrasonic pressure. A heavy footfall announced the arrival of Colonel Borodin. The atmosphere in the room curdled instantly. The colonel walked with a limp, a reminder of the Great Patriotic War, and he despised the Stalions as much as he envied their potential. He stopped at the foot of the table and prodded the commander's new hydraulic leg with his polished boot. "The marshal is coming in 3 days," Borodin announced, his eyes fixed on Hans. "He expects to see the first squad move in perfect unison. If one gear slips, if one man whimpers, I will personally ensure that your own nervous systems are donated to the next batch of prototypes. Am I clear, German?" "The synchronization is complex, Colonel," Hans replied, his voice flat. "The interface between organic tissue and cold steel is prone to rejection. The Soviet man does not reject the gift of the state." Borodin barked. "He embraces it. Make them walk, Hans. Or I will make you crawl." When Borodin left, the silence in the room was heavy. The tank commander on the table suddenly turned his head toward Hans. His mechanical throat clicked, and a rasping, metallic voice emerged, sounding like sandpaper on a gravestone. "Let him come," the commander croaked. Hans froze. The prisoners were not supposed to be able to form words yet. The brass membranes were strictly for non-verbal signaling and internal communication. "Captain Volkov." Hans whispered, using the man's name for the first time. "The steel is cold," the commander continued, his eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "But the blood is still hot. Tell the one-eyed man the frequency is ready. We do not want to walk. We want to run." Lev stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, hand-crank tuning fork he had fashioned from a scrap of Victory alloy. He struck it against the table. The sound was tiny, almost nothing. But as the vibration traveled through the floor, a low, guttural thrumming rose from the levels below. It was the sound of 49 other steel-clad men, deep in the bowls of the mountain, vibrating in sympathy. The pipes groaned. The surgical tools on Hans' tray began to dance. "The symphony is composed," Lev said, looking at Hans. "The only question is, Doctor, are you ready to conduct the final movement? Or are you just another bolt in their machine?" Hans looked at his own hands, the mechanical manipulators that had caused so much pain. He realized that for months, he had been trying to remain human by staying detached. But to survive the Ural winter, to survive Borodin, he had to become something else. He had to be the bridge. I am no conductor, Hans said, reaching for a heavy wrench. I am a saboteur. Tell Volkov to prepare his men. When the marshal arrives, we will not show them a parade. We will show them an earthquake. Part 3, the resonance of the dam. The morning of the marshal's arrival was heralded by a sky the color of a bruised plum. A blizzard had descended upon the Urals, screaming through the jagged peaks and burying the electrified fences of Alloy 7 under drifts of crystalline white. Inside the mountain, however, the air was unnervingly still. The usual industrial cacophony had been replaced by a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Hans's bones. The Sharashka had been scrubbed clean. Red banners draped the damp concrete walls, bearing slogans about the infallible triumph of Soviet science. In the center of the great hall, a cavernous hangar carved out of granite, 50 stallions stood in 5 rows of 10. They were terrifying to behold. Their bodies were encased in dull, matte gray plates of tungsten steel, held together by thick rivets and hydraulic pistons that hissed with every micro-adjustment. Their heads were encased in smooth, featureless helmets with only a thin slit for the red-tinted optical sensors. Hans stood on a raised observation deck, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Next to him, Lev was adjusting the dials on a portable monitoring station. To any observer, he was checking the vitals of the units. In reality, he was fine-tuning the resonance filters. The marshal has entered the perimeter, Borodin's voice boomed over the intercom. All personnel to your stations. Initiate the compliance protocol. Hans reached for the master switch. This was the moment of no return. According to the official manual, this switch would activate the will suppression field, a series of electromagnetic pulses that turned the prisoners into meat puppets. But as Hans's hand closed over the lever, he remembered Volkov's words, the blood is still hot. Now, Lev whispered. Hans threw the switch. Down in the hangar, 50 heads snapped up in perfect, terrifying unison. The sound of 50 steel necks clicking was like a volley of rifle fire. On the far side of the hall, the massive armored doors ground open, admitting a gust of freezing wind and a small group of men in heavy wool overcoats. In the center walked Marshal Zhukov's representative, a man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that had seen the end of the world. Report, the representative barked, his voice echoing in the vast space. Borodin stepped forward, snapping a crisp salute. Comrade General, I present to you the Iron Guard. They require no food, they feel no fear, and they know only the will of the party. They are the ultimate synthesis of Soviet ideology and Soviet steel. Borodin turned to the ranks. Unit 01. Advance. Captain Volkov, Subject 01, stepped forward. The floor groaned under the weight of his 300-kilogram frame. Each step was a rhythmic explosion of sound. But it was not the sound of a machine. As Volkov moved, the brass membranes in his throat began to hum. It was a low, subsonic vibration that made the water in the general's glass ripple. What is that noise? The general asked, narrowing his eyes. A minor calibration issue, Comrade General, Borodin said, his voice tightening. The cooling fans are, it is not a fan, the general interrupted, stepping closer to Volkov. He reached out a gloved hand to touch the chest plate. It feels like a heartbeat. At that moment, the hum changed. It stopped being a vibration and became a melody, a distorted, metallic version of the Internationale, played through the friction of grinding gears and shrieking steel. It was the sound of 1,000 ghosts screaming in a foundry. Unit 01, halt. Borodin screamed, reaching for his own remote override. Volkov did not halt. He reached out a massive, steel-taloned hand and gently, almost delicately, caught Borodin's wrist. The sound of the colonel's radius and ulna snapping was lost in the rising crescendo of the mechanical choir. The experiment, Volkov's voice erupted from his chest grill, amplified by every other stallion in the room, is over. The general turned to flee, but the other 49 stallions had already begun to move. They did not march, they flowed like a river of molten iron. The guards at the doors raised their PPSH submachine guns and opened fire. The bullets sparked off the Stalions' carapaces like hail off a tin roof. From the observation deck, Hans watched the slaughter begin. It was methodical. The Stalions did not use guns, they used their bodies. They swung their hydraulic limbs with enough force to liquefy bone. They were the perfect soldiers the USSR wanted, but they were fueled by a decade of concentrated, frozen rage. "We have to go," Lev urged, grabbing Hans' arm. "The secondary security teams will blow the tunnels. We need to follow Volkov." They scrambled down the back stairs, dodging the sprays of hydraulic fluid and blood that now painted the walls of the great hall. The air was filled with the smell of cordite and the terrifying singing of the brass throats. As they reached the hangar floor, the scene was a nightmare of red and gray. Borodin was pinned to a pillar by a steel rod through his shoulder, forced to watch as his creation dismantled his life's work. Volkov stood before him, the red light of his sensors glowing like embers. "Engineer," Volkov said, turning his head toward Hans. The metal plates of his face shifted, mimicking a smile. "The mountain is awake. We go to the surface." "You'll never make it," Hans stammered, looking at the carnage. "They'll send the Air Force. They'll nuke the valley." "Let them," Volkov rasped. "We are steel. We do not burn. We only temper." The Stallion smashed through the final set of blast doors, the freezing Ural wind rushing in to meet the heat of the battle. Hans and Lev followed into the white blinding light of the blizzard, caught between the monsters they had built and the monsters who had ordered them built. The world outside the mountain was a screaming void of white. The blizzard hit Hans like a physical blow, threatening to freeze the breath in his lungs. Behind him, the great steel doors of Alloy 7 lay mangled, looking like the jaws of a dead beast. Ahead, the 50 Stallions moved through the waist-deep snow with an eerie, rhythmic efficiency. They did not struggle against the drifts, their heavy, heated limbs melted the snow, leaving a trail of black, steaming slush behind them. Hans stumbled, his boots losing purchase on the ice, but a massive, cold hand caught his collar. It was Subject 14, the former tank commander. The metal of the giant's arm was so hot from the internal friction of the servos that it hissed as the snowflakes touched it. "Keep moving," the machineman rasped. "The forest provides cover." As they descended into the valley, the scale of the massacre behind them became clear. The Soviet outer perimeter guards had tried to set up a blocking position with T-34 tanks. It had been a slaughter. Hans saw the remains of a tank turret tossed 50 meters into the pines like a discarded toy. The Stallions had not used shells, they had simply walked up to the iron giants and torn them apart with their bare, hydraulic hands. "Look," Lev whispered, pointing toward the ridge. Through the veil of snow, Hans saw long, glowing lines of red light. The Stallions were signaling to each other. They were no longer using the brass membranes for music, they were transmitting data. "They are networking, Hans," Lev said, his voice a mix of awe and terror. "My subharmonics. I thought I was giving them a way to talk. But I gave them a way to merge. They are not 50 men anymore. They are a single, distributed intelligence. A hive mind made of Soviet spite and German engineering." By nightfall, they reached a deep ravine sheltered by ancient fir trees. The Stallions formed a circle, their backs to the wind, creating a wall of warm metal. Hans and Lev huddled in the center, basking in the radiant heat coming off the armored plates. It was the only reason they were still alive. "Volkov," Hans called out, his voice trembling from the cold. "What is the plan? Where are we going? There is nowhere in the Union they would not find you." The lead Stallion turned. In the darkness, Volkov's red optical sensors were the only source of light. He looked less human than he had in the lab. The ice had frozen over his rivets, giving him a jagged, crystalline appearance. "We do not seek a place," Volkov replied. His voice was becoming more synthesized, losing the cadence of human speech. "We seek the source." "The source of what?" "The steel," Volkov said. "The motherland, she gave us this skin. We will return it to her heart. We are marching to Magnitogorsk. We will take the furnaces. We will grow." Hans felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. They were not just escaping, they were migrating. They wanted to reach the great industrial centers of the Urals, not to destroy them, but to use them as a womb. If 50 Stalions were a nightmare, 1,000 would be the end of history. As the night deepened, Hans watched Lev. The physicist was sitting very still, his back against Subject 22's leg. He was holding his small tuning fork, but he was not striking it. He was listening. Lev. Hans whispered. We have to stop them. If they reach the city. Lev turned his head. His one eye was wide, reflecting the red glow of the Stalions. Stop them. Hans, look at us. We are the architects of the new world. Did you really think we could go back to being men? To being prisoners? Lev reached out and grabbed Hans' hand. His grip was unnervingly strong, far stronger than any starving academic should possess. I did not just modify their canisters, Hans, Lev whispered, a manic grin spreading across his face. I modified our own rations back at the lab. The supplements they gave us. Microfilaments. Silver lead tracers. Hans tried to pull his hand away, but his fingers felt heavy. A strange, metallic taste filled his mouth, the same taste he had noticed for weeks. He looked down at his arm. Under the skin of his wrist, he saw a faint, silvery pulse. The resonance, Lev giggled, a sound that was half human, half static. It's already in us, Hans. We are not the conductors. We are the first of the new breed. We do not need the heavy armor, not yet. We are the nervous system. They are the muscle. Suddenly, the mountain air was split by a high-pitched whistle. A flare ignited the sky in a harsh, chemical green. Katyusha's, Volkov's voice boomed. Brace. The horizon exploded. The Soviet military had finally found them, and they were not interested in capturing their property. They were going to erase the valley. The sky did not just fall, it shattered. The Katyusha rockets, known as Stalions organs, shrieked through the freezing air, their trails of fire cutting the blizzard into ribbons. The first barrage struck the ridge above the ravine, sending thousands of tons of rock and shattered timber cascading down. The ground buckled. The Stalions did not flinch. They moved with a synchronized grace that was sickening to watch, a ballet of 5-ton titans. Phalanx. Volkov's voice tore through the thunder. The 50 giants slammed their shoulders together, their interlocking armor plates creating a sloped, metallic roof. Hans was shoved beneath this canopy of hot steel. Above him, the rockets impacted. The sound was not a bang, but a continuous, bone-shaking roar of metal screaming against metal. The heat became unbearable. The Stalions were absorbing the kinetic energy of the explosions, their cooling systems venting clouds of superheated steam that turned the ravine into a white-out fog. Hans looked at his own hands in the steam. The silvery veins beneath his skin were no longer faint. They were glowing with a soft, pulsing bioluminescence. He felt a strange, rhythmic thrumming in his teeth. It was the song of the Stalions, but he was not hearing it with his ears anymore. He was feeling it directly in his motor cortex. Target. Left. 300 meters. T-54 platoon. The data flashed behind his eyelids like a lightning strike. He was not just a passenger, he was becoming a node in the network. Lev. Hans screamed, grabbing the physicist by his tattered coat. My head. I can see them. I can see the tanks through the mountain. Lev was staring at his own palm. A shard of shrapnel had sliced his skin, but instead of red blood, a thick, mercury-like fluid was oozing out, weaving itself back together like a living loom. The transition is accelerating, Lev whispered, his voice now a perfect, synthesized baritone. The external trauma, it's triggering the self-repair protocols. We are being born, Hans. Stop fighting the steel. Become the alloy. The bombardment shifted. The Red Army was moving in for the kill. From the fog emerged the silhouettes of the specialized liquidator units, heavy infantry equipped with flamethrowers and anti-tank rifles. Behind them, the roar of diesel engines signaled the approach of a full armored regiment. The motherland is persistent, Volkov rasped. He stepped out from the phalanx, his armor glowing cherry red from the rocket fire. She wants her medal back. Let us give it to her. Volkov did not use a weapon. He pointed his hand toward the lead T-54. The brass membrane in his chest emitted a sound so sharp, so high frequency, that Hans' nose began to bleed. The tank's thick frontal armor did not explode, it simply lost its molecular cohesion. The steel turned to dust, collapsing into a pile of gray powder, leaving the horrified crew sitting in an open chassis. The Stalions charged. It was no longer a battle, it was a harvest. Hans watched as Subject 22 leaped onto a tank, tore the hatch off with one hand, and reached inside. There was a wet, crunching sound, and then silence. The Stalions were moving faster now, the silver lead tracers in their artificial nerves allowing them to react at the speed of electricity. Hans felt a surge of horrific euphoria. Through the link, he felt Volkov's strength. He felt the cold satisfaction of the tank commander as he crushed a field radio. But beneath the euphoria was a growing, jagged fear. He was losing the memory of his mother's face. He was forgetting the smell of bread. The Stalion consciousness was a desert of logic and rage, and it was swallowing him whole. "We are nearing the rail line," Volkov's voice echoed in Hans' mind. "The train to Magnitogorsk. It carries the raw ore. We will intercept. We will feed." They reached the iron tracks just as a massive steam locomotive thundered through the pass. The Stalions did not stop the train, they merged with it. They latched onto the moving cars with magnetic grips, their heavy bodies tilting the entire convoy. Hans was hoisted up by Volkov. As he hit the cold steel of the ore car, a final, desperate human thought flickered in his mind: if we reach the furnaces, the world ends. I am the one who built the lock. I must be the one to break it. But as he looked at Lev, he saw the physicist already plugging his glowing fingers into the train's control systems. Lev was not a man anymore. He was a ghost in the machine, his eyes replaced by the same flickering red sensors as the giant's. "Next stop, Hans," Lev's voice hissed through the train's iron walls. The Heart of the Empire. Part 6, The Heart of the Empire. Magnitogorsk was a city built of soot and shadow, a sprawling industrial titan that never slept. At its center stood the great furnaces, gigantic, fire-breathing cathedrals of iron where the Earth's crust was melted down to forge the Soviet soul. As the hijacked ore train screeched into the heart of the complex, the sky was already glowing a hellish orange. The Stalions did not wait for the train to stop. They leaped from the moving cars like iron meteors, shattering the concrete platforms. The factory guards, thousands of them, opened fire from every catwalk and crane. It was a curtain of lead, but the Stalions moved through it with the indifference of ghosts walking through rain. They were not just fighting anymore, they were coming home. Hans felt the heat of the furnaces calling to him. The silver in his blood was screaming, vibrating in sympathy with the thousands of tons of molten metal nearby. He stumbled toward the central control tower, his legs moving with a heavy, hydraulic jerkiness. His skin felt like a tight, suffocating glove. "Volkov!" Hans shouted, though the name felt like a relic of a dead language. "Stop. If you enter the vats, you'll lose everything. There will be no men left, only a monster." Volkov stood at the edge of the great vat, a lake of bubbling, white-hot liquid steel. He turned his helmeted head. The red glow in his eyes was blinding now. "You still do not understand, engineer," the machine rasped. "There were no men in the camps. Only scrap. We are not becoming monsters. We are becoming the state." Lev was already at the main terminal, his fingers fused into the data ports. He looked back at Hans, his face a smooth mask of silver. "The network is hungry, Hans. Join us. The Union wants a perfect machine. We will give it one that never stops growing." With a roar that shook the foundations of the city, Volkov stepped into the molten steel. Hans expected to see the metal melt away the flesh. Instead, he saw a miracle of horror. The molten iron did not destroy Volkov, it adhered to him. It flowed up his limbs, thickening his armor, expanding his frame. The other 49 Stalions followed, walking into the fire like pilgrims. They were merging, their individual forms dissolving into a single, colossal entity of shifting, liquid metal that began to rise from the vat, a towering titan of iron that occupied the entire height of the factory. Hans fell to his knees, his mind fracturing. The hive mind was a roar of a million voices, all chanting the same mechanical prayer. He reached for his neuro-welder, the one tool he had kept from the lab, intending to short-circuit the terminal and kill the link. "Do not," a voice whispered. Hans looked up. Standing there was Colonel Borodin. He was horribly burned, his arm a mangled stump, but he was smiling. He was not trying to stop the monster. He was holding a glass of vodka. What is this?" Hans gasped, his voice cracking into static. "You thought you were a rebel, German," Borodin laughed, his voice wet with blood. "You thought that one-eyed physicist was your friend. Look at the logo on the back of Lev's neck. Look at the serial number." Hans stared at the terminal. Under the grime, he saw the seal of the MGB, the Ministry of State Security. "The experiment was not about building soldiers," Borodin whispered, leaning in. "We have millions of soldiers. The experiment was about the alloy. We needed a way to turn the resentment of the prisoners into a weapon that could never be turned against us. We needed a hive mind that believed it was free, so it would fight with the passion of revolutionaries, while being hard-coded to the great plan." Hans looked at Lev. The physicist did not deny it. His red sensors flickered with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. "The rebellion was the final stage of the calibration, Hans," Lev said. "A machine that thinks it is a man is a toy. A machine that thinks it is a god, that is an empire. You were the catalyst. Your sabotage provided the exact frequency of rage we needed to jumpstart the fusion." The giant in the vat, the Gestalt of Volkov and the others, suddenly stopped its roar. It turned its massive, molten face toward the Kremlin, 1,000 miles away. It was not going to destroy the USSR. It was going to become the USSR. A literal, unkillable iron curtain. "And what about me?" Hans screamed, his body finally seizing as the silver in his veins reached his heart. "What am I?" Borodin drained his glass and threw it into the fire. You read the warranty, Hans. Every machine needs a soul to burn for fuel. Welcome to the 5-year plan." The silver fire erupted behind Hans' eyes. His vision turned to a static-filled red. His last human sensation was the feeling of his ribs being crushed from the inside by a heart that had finally, successfully, turned to steel. He did not die. He simply became a line of code in a nightmare that would never end. Above Magnitogorsk, the Iron Titan began to walk, and for the first time in history, the statues of the motherland began to breathe.